The Bastøy prison in Norway is a minimum security prison on Bastøy Island. Of the 60 employees at the prison, only 5 remain on the island overnight. The 115 inmate prison was once a prison colony for young boys and is now trying to become the first ecological prison in the world. Before the current prison was open, the island was a juvenile detention center, Bastøy Boys Home. The boys' home was taken over by the Norwegian government in 1953 and eventually shut down in 1970. In 1915, the boys rallied around 4 youth who had escaped and been recaptured, causing the May 20th Rebellion. Later dramatized in the 2010 film King of Devil's Island, Bastøy Island was once known for its brutal reformatory. However, today it is the site of the progressive Bastøy prison. In the 38 years of operation, only one escape has been attempted, as the inmates know how easy they have it and fear the consequences of escaping. The consequences for attempted escape involves the inmate being transferred to one of the most strict prisons in Norway. Since this prison is focused on rehabilitation instead of punishment, the inmates and guards get along. The inmates live in cottages, have a prison chef, a sauna, tennis court, and horseback riding. While at most prisons, the inmates' days are dictated for them, told what to do from the moment they're woken up to the moment they go to bed, the inmates at Bastøy have to learn how to fill their own days, making some transitions from more standard prisons harder than expected. The Justice Center Leoben in Styria, Austria looks more like a modern library or office building than it does a prison holding 205 inmates. The prison is at capacity, with convicts including those who have been convicted of felonies. The prison was designed in 2004 and has started a debate on the treatment of prisoners and prisons of the future. Critics of the prison say that it's too lax on the criminals, as each criminal has a living space with their own kitchenette, abundant natural light, barred-off balconies, and a courtyard. The prison has often been compared to a one-bedroom apartment, drawing critique from around the world. The Champ Dolan is located in Switzerland. Originally overcrowded, holding over 600 inmates in a building designed to house 200, this changed in 2011. $40 million was allocated to the prison, and again in 2020 when they dispersed prisoners for COVID. Prior to this, there were a number of prisoner riots, suicides, overdoses, and natural disasters. Addywell was designed as a learning prison in Addywell, Scotland, between Glasgow and Edinburgh. Addywell houses all types of offenders with the exception of females and young offenders. With the prison being a learning prison, the inmates address their offending behavior and the circumstances that led to their imprisonment. The prison offers 40 hours of what they call purposeful activity a week. Purposeful activity is divided into 3 main categories: learning skills, jobs, and programmed interventions. The prison also boasts a peer support model where inmates are identified for roles throughout the prison where they can act as a positive role model for the other inmates. Aranjuez, 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 I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce this one, is often described as Spain's 5-star prison for families. Children ages 3 and younger can stay with their parents in one of the 36 family unit cells. The prison has cribs, Disney characters on the wall, and a prison playground for the kids just outside the prison walls. They allow the children to stay with their parents since they're too young to understand separation. While a lot of inmates are happy about the situation, they say it isn't the ideal place to raise a child. Doi. As in a number of ways, they are imprisoned as well. For a baby, this would be the only world they know, one of prison. Once a child reaches the age of 3, then they're taken and put with relatives, or social services if there's no family available. Because before 3, they don't know what separation is. After 3, kick them the heck out of there. The prison has sparked controversy throughout the world. Francis Cook, director of the Howard's League for Penal Reform, is on record as saying, quote, It is not an advance. Prisons are the wrong place for children. There is a lot of evidence that show they will be affected in the long term. They don't see animals, they don't see trees, they don't have the stimulation that is needed to grow as a healthy child. San Quentin is referred to as the arena by prisoners and is the oldest prison in California. San Quentin is home to the only death row for male inmates in the state of California and the largest in the United States. Every man who has ever been sentenced to death in California, with some minor exceptions, must be held at San Quentin. Death row is divided into 3 sections. The north section for prisoners who don't cause trouble, the east block, a crumbling, leaky maze of a place, built in 1927, and the adjustment center for, quote, the worst of the worst. As of 2015, death row had a capacity of 715 prisoners. It holds many notable prisoners, such as Iswaro Aguirre, who tortured and killed his girlfriend's 8-year-old son Gabriel, and was the subject of the Netflix series The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez. Brandon Browner, former NFL player, Charles Manson, leader of the Manson family, Richard Ramirez, known as the serial killer The Night Stalker, and the actor Danny Trejo spent time here from 1965 to 1968 for stabbing a sailor in the face with broken glass. Offshore from San Francisco, California is the infamous Alcatraz prison, located on Alcatraz Island. When the U.S. first got the island from Mexico following the Mexican-American War, President Millard Fillmore ordered that Alcatraz Island be used as a fort for the United States. Fort Alcatraz was used as the San Francisco arsenal for storage of firearms during the Civil War so they would not fall into the hands of Confederate sympathizers. Later on during the war, the island was used to house Confederate sympathizers and privateers along the west coast. Alcatraz got its first official prison in 1867 when a brick jailhouse was built. Prior to this, prisoners were kept in the basement of the guardhouse. The next year, in 1868, Alcatraz was officially designated as a long-term detention facility for military prisoners. On October 2, 1993, the island barracks were taken over by the U.S. Department of Justice, and the island was officially designated as a federal prison 1 year later, in August of 1934. The first group of federal prisoners to enter the penitentiary arrived on August 11, 1934. The 137 prisoners were handcuffed in high-security locks and guarded by 60 specially selected FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and since they were arriving in San Francisco via train, railway security officers. The original 155 members of the staff were all highly trained in security, but not rehabilitation. This was due to the fact that Alcatraz was intended for prisoners who caused trouble at other federal prisons and was considered a last resort prison, holding the worst of the worst, with no hopes of rehabilitation. Alcatraz prison quickly gained notoriety as the toughest prison in America, considered by many to be the worst prison of the time. Frank Murphy, U.S. Attorney General at the time, said, quote, "The whole institution is conducive to psychology that builds up a sinister, ambitious attitude among prisoners," end quote. While an author described it as, quote, "the great garbage can of the San Francisco Bay into which every federal prison dumped its most rotten apples," end quote. Kind of ironic considering San Francisco's as a whole is kind of the garbage can of San Francisco. There was a number of escape attempts from the island, a total of 14 to be exact. With a total of 36 prisoners, 23 were caught, 6 were shot and killed, 2 drowned, and 5 are listed as missing, presumed drowned. Of the most famous escape attempts, the June 1962 Alcatraz escape was this prison's most famous. 2 brothers, John and Clarence Anglin, and their pal Frank Morris attempted an escape off the island. Behind their cells was a 3-foot, unguarded utility corridor. The prisoners would chip away at the salt-damaged wall during music hour, with the sound of the accordions masking the chiseling. When it came time to escape, they placed papier-mâché dummies with human hair on their beds, entered the vent of the roof, and escaped to their inflatable raft made from over 50 raincoats they had stolen. While attempting to investigate the escape, the FBI closed their investigation, saying it was unlikely that they could have made the 1.25 mile journey to the shore with the strong currents and cold ocean temperatures. However, the U.S. Marshal case remains open and active. In the early 2010s, there was circumstantial evidence found that suggested that the men had survived. According to the FBI, their raft was never recovered and no cars were reported being stolen that night. However, a raft was discovered on the nearby Angel Island, and a 1955 blue Chevrolet had indeed been reported stolen by 3 men, the same night that the 3 men escaped. Relatives of the 2 Anglin brothers presented further evidence of the escape, saying they had fled to Brazil, and brought forward a picture from 1975 of 2 men that resembled John and Clarence. A facial recognition analyst concluded that it was, in fact, them. It is believed that the FBI was engaged in a cover-up of the escape, so trust in the FBI would not diminish. Ooh. Tell me the same FBI that did Waco doesn't want their reputation tarnished? The most famous prisoner to ever be held at Alcatraz was Al Capone, notorious bootlegger and gangster. If you were to go to Alcatraz Island today, as it is a national park and you can go visit it, you can see Al Capone still on display. Due to its rough past and the Native Americans of the region believing evil spirits dwelt there long before anything was built, it is considered to be a top 5 haunted location in California. The prison officially shut down on March 21st, 1963, and is now a popular tourist attraction. The Tombs is a nickname for the Manhattan Dungeon Complex. Looking at the history of the prison, it actually got the name The Tomb because the building complex was an Egyptian revival design inspired by an Egyptian tomb. After a few hours of research on the complex, I couldn't find anything else about it. I was doing research left and right. I was like, complex riots, complex, the Tombs prison starvation, the Tombs prison riots. I couldn't find anything. If you can find anything, let me know. But I think it's on there because of the name and because it was designed after an Egyptian tomb. Gulags isn't the name of a specific prison. Gulags were a chain and network of forced labor camps in the Soviet Union. Originally set up by Vladimir Lenin, gulags didn't reach their peak until Joseph Stalin's rule in the 1930s to the early 1950s. Originally intended as prisons for the most serious of criminals and crimes, they quickly became sites for political enemies, people who spoke out against the state. Doctors, writers, students, artists, scientists, etc. were all sent to the gulags if they had any ties to or even spoke with anti-Stalinists. This wasn't just men, it was women and children as well. Many women faced the threat of assault and even forcible sexual assault. I have to replace the word with forcible sexual assault, but you know what I'm saying. It wasn't uncommon for people headed to the gulag to just be picked up off the street by the government security police with no trial and thrown onto a train. One of the worst tragedies to ever happen at a gulag is the Nazino tragedy. Roughly 6,700 prisoners were sent to Nazino Island in western Siberia in 1933. Their job was to construct a special settlement and work the land. They were sent with only flour for food, which they mostly ate on the journey to the island. They had little to no tools, and they were left without any additional clothing against the harsh Siberian weather. Any prisoner who tried to escape was shot and killed by the guards. The conditions broke down quickly and resulted in violence, disease, and cannibalism. In 13 weeks, over 4,000 of the 6,700 prisoners had died, and those who were still alive were severely ill. 2,856 prisoners were sent back to smaller, already established gulags, and 157 were left on the island as they were too poor health to be moved. The Nazino tragedy wasn't revealed or discovered until 1988, 55 years later. Geographics on YouTube actually has a great video on the Nazino tragedy. I would recommend you look it up. I've heard it said before that waterboarding at Guantanamo Bay sounds like a great time if you don't know what either of those things are. I have nowhere to go from that. I don't have a good transition into Guantanamo Bay. I just really wanted to say it because I thought the joke was clever, and this is Guantanamo Bay. Seemed like a good place to put it. Guantanamo Bay is a prison that was opened in 2002 and is still operable today. The Geneva Convention lists torture as both a war crime and a crime against humanity, yet it is rumored to run rampant at Guantanamo Bay. Not only is it rumored to be happening, it was confirmed to be happening by FBI officials. An FBI agent was quoted as saying, quote, On a couple of occasions, I entered interview rooms to find a detainee chained hand and foot in fetal position on the floor, with no chair, food, or water. Most times they had urinated or defecated on themselves and had been left there for 18, 24 hours or more." End quote. Air Force Lieutenant General Randall Schmidt concluded that a man was subject to, quote, "abusive and degrading treatment" by interrogation methods, the techniques of which were authorized by the Pentagon. Released prisoners tell of beatings, sleep deprivations, enemas, humiliation, and excessive time spent constrained in uncomfortable positions. Army specialist Sean Baker was a soldier posing as a prisoner during training exercises at the camp. He was beaten so severely that he suffered a brain injury and seizures. There's a lot more to go into on Guantanamo Bay. I don't want to get this channel into the bad graces of YouTube on my first video, but please do some more research on this topic. Located in the Bronx of New York sits Rikers Island. Rikers Island has had to pay settlements many times, twice due to strip searches. In 1986, federal court ruled that strip searches could not be performed on people arrested on misdemeanor charges. However, Rikers was sued as recently as 2007 for strip searching misdemeanor detainees, paying a total of $83 million. In 2008, a correctional officer was indicted after he allegedly used a specially selected group of teens as enforcers, essentially using them as a way to control the other prisoners. In 2012, Captain Sherman Graham and Assistant Deputy Warden Gail Lewis were found guilty on all charges of covering up an assault on an inmate. In 2014, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York issued a report condemning the systematic and continuing abuse and violations of prisoners' constitutional rights. In spite of this and many other incidents of abuse, few officers have been prosecuted successfully or removed from their positions. Rikers Island is set to be closed by 2026. The maximum security prison found in Terre Haute, Indiana, is the holding unit for male federal inmates who have been sentenced to death and holds the federal execution chamber. There haven't been as many scandals or wrongdoings at this prison, and I actually believe that it's on this list as it houses the federal inmates that were sentenced to death, as well as the execution chamber. The Attica Correctional Facility in Attica, New York was originally opened in 1931 and has hosted a number of criminals during its time of operation. Attica is a maximum security prison and has only ever had one person escape. Joseph Mad Dog Sullivan was a mobster for the Genovese crime family of New York and is the only person to have ever escaped. One of the most prominent cases involving this prison is the inmates of Attica Correctional Facility versus Rockefeller. The case affirmed the rights of state prosecutors to choose whether to investigate and prosecute individuals that had potentially committed a crime. There was one rebellion which took place in 1971, where inmates took control of the prison for several days, seeking to negotiate the improvement of conditions and treatment of the overcrowded prison. 43 people were killed during the standoff. 9 hostages and 30 prisoners were killed by law enforcement gunfire. 1 guard died of injuries sustained on the first day of the rebellion, and 3 prisoners were killed by other prisoners. La Fontaine Prison, found in the Montparnasse district of France, is one of the most infamous prisons in the country, having both a high security wing as well as a VIP wing. During the Nazi occupation of France, 18 resistance fighters were executed, 9 were killed by guillotine, and the other 9 were shot. In 2000, the head doctor of the prison published a book denouncing the very poor prison conditions. Most famously, the prison has held the military dictator of Panama and Jean-Luc Brunel, the former head of a French model agency who was accused of supplying young girls to the person who did not kill himself, Jeffrey Epstein, and was also, oddly enough, found hanged in his cell. Opened in 1880, Folsom is California's second oldest prison, only being surpassed by San Quentin, listed earlier on this list. Folsom was one of the first ever maximum security prisons and is the execution site of 93 prisoners. The most notable people housed here were also some of the most notable people housed in San Quentin: Danny Trejo and Charles Manson. In the 1970s and 80s, violence at the prison peaked. The Mexican Mafia, the Black Guerrilla family, and other prison gangs made prisons increasingly dangerous, leading to the establishment of secure housing units. Johnny Cash actually put on 2 live shows at this prison. They were recorded and released as his live album entitled At Folsom Prison. Very accurate name. He had actually written and recorded the song Folsom Prison Blues more than a decade before he visited. In the heart of Vladimir, Russia is the country's largest prison. First opened in 1783, the prison hosts inmates serving a minimum of 10 years. It was made to hold all political prisoners, but eventually became part of the Gulag system in the USSR. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the prison was reverted to a regular detention facility. There was a museum about the prison opened on the prison grounds in 1996. While it's currently the largest prison in Russia by capacity, it is set to be surpassed by a prison called Kretsy II in St. Petersburg. Guldani Prison is infamous for the Guldani prison scandal. The Georgian prison had many videos leaked, showing prison guards and their commanding officers torturing, taunting, and sexually abusing prisoners. Once the videos were released, there were many protests in the country, and the chairman of the penitentiary department was fired. And, after firing the chairman, the Minister of Corrections herself resigned. The videos were released by a former prison officer who fled to Belgium and was wanted in connection to the abuse. Eventually, the prosecution decided to drop the charges as a result of a plea bargain, as he had helped to uncover, quote, systematic crimes in the Georgian penitentiary. The videos range from verbal and physical abuse to youth inmates being forced to insult thieves under the threat of being forced into sexual intercourse if they did not comply. Known as Arizona's concentration camp, Tent City was supposed to be a temporary overflow area for Arizona's overcrowded prison population. Tent City is set in the scorching Phoenix heat, with essentially just tent shade to keep the heat out. The prison was first built in 1993 and wasn't closed until 2017, despite it supposing to be a temporary solution that was supposed to last a few years maximum. Inmates were forced into chain gangs, which were widely abandoned across the US in 1955. Detention officers didn't want to work in Tent City because of the dangerous conditions. There weren't a lot of officers there, so if there was a riot, there wasn't a lot of backup. During one protest in 1996, prisoners even burned down some of the tents. The prison was known to hold a lot of undocumented immigrants, and was also known as a holding center for prisoners that needed to be transferred elsewhere. Located in a 1,200-acre unattended field in Kenya, the Kamati Maximum Security Prison is a nightmare for prisoners. While no executions have happened in Kenya since 1987, people are still being killed and beaten regularly. The prison has no reliable water supply and has to depend on over 200 of the prisoners hauling water buckets around all day. Within the prison itself, the most feared block is G Block. A search for cell phones was done in G Block on November 17, 2008, resulting in a brutal beating by the wardens, all of which was captured on cell phones that had been snuck in. The video was given to the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights and showed on Kenya TV. The prison was built to hold 1,400 prisoners and now houses over 3,600. The Butyurka prison, located in central Moscow, is a holding cell for people awaiting trial. The current building was built in 1879 on the site of a prison fortress that had been built during the regime of Catherine the Great. During the February Revolution in 1917, the workers of Moscow freed all the political prisoners from the prison, and following the October Revolution, it remained a place of political prisoners and a transfer prison for people sentenced to be sent to a gulag. The prison is highly overcrowded, and overcrowding has been an issue for a long time. Cells made to hold 10 prisoners often hold 100 plus. To try to curb disease in the prison, people that have a certain disease are all held together in one cell. So people with AIDS in one cell, tuberculosis in one cell, etc., all kept in the same cell. However, since many of the inmates are drug users, disease runs rampant. Some of the most famous prisoners that have been kept here are the founder of the KGB and Heinz Hitler, Adolf's favorite nephew, who died after several days of torture. I don't know how to pronounce these, so I have to copy and paste into Google Translate and then listen to it. The Diyarbakir prison, located in Turkey, had its most infamous time as a prison right after it opened. Opened in 1980, what is called the period of barbarity, or the hell of Diyarbakir. How do I say this again? Opened in 1980, what is called the period of barbarity, or the hell of Diyarbakir, happened between the years of 1981 and 1984. The prisoners were subject to horrific acts of torture, and 34 people lost their lives. At the time, the Times British newspaper listed it among the 10 most notorious jails in the world. The period of barbarity, mentioned earlier, was full of horrific and common acts of torture. Listed methods of torture were, get ready, there's a lot: beatings, hair pulling, being stripped naked, blindfolded and hosed, solitary confinement, death threats, a dog called Joe who was trained to bite the genitals of naked prisoners, sleep, sensory, water, and food deprivation for extended periods of time, hanging by the arms, stress positions, excessive exercise in extreme temperatures, stretching, squeezing, or crushing of limbs and genitals, asphyxia, electric shock, cigarette burns, extraction of nails and healthy teeth, sexual humiliation and assault, and baths in prison sewers. 17 prisoners died from the torture and beatings in the years of 1981 to 1984, while 7 died of hunger strikes. 4 more set themselves on fire during this time. I can't imagine living in a place where I would rather set myself on fire than continue to live there. In 2009, plans to convert the prison into a school were announced. However, as of this moment, it is still an open prison. Officially named Penal Colony Number 6 of the Federal Penitentiary Service of Russia in Orenburg Oblast, the Black Dolphin Prison is one of the oldest prisons in Russia. I can see why they shortened it. That's a mouthful. Poor Dave, he got sentenced to the Penal Colony Number 6 of the Federal Penitentiary Service of Russia in Orenburg Oblast. Too long. The prison gets its nickname from the sculpture of a black dolphin which is set in front of the main entrance. The prison holds about 700 of the country's worst criminals, including child molesters, murderers, terrorists, cannibals, and serial killers. Every prisoner at Black Dolphin is serving life sentences and kept isolated in cells that have 3 sets of steel doors. Prisoners are allowed to exercise in a large cage for 90 minutes a day while the wardens search the cell for contraband. Inmates are under 24-hour surveillance. They are not permitted to rest or sit on their bunks from the time they wake up until their appointed bedtime, which is about 16 hours. When prison officers make a command to the inmates, they must respond with the words, "Yes, sir." A guard makes rounds every 15 minutes to keep tabs on the prisoners and to ensure that they are following prison rules. The prisoners are fed soup 4 times a day for their meals. When an inmate arrives, they are blindfolded so that they cannot map out the prison or plan escapes. Inmates are also blindfolded when they're being transported between buildings, while bent at their waist and their hands held behind their back above their hips, as it allows for maximum control of the inmate. The Penitentiary of New Mexico was the scene of one of the most violent prison riots in United States history. The riot was, quote, "a predictable incident based on an assessment of prison conditions," wrote author Roger Morris. Overcrowding and inferior prison services were major causes of the riot. On the night the riot started, there were 1,156 inmates in a prison that had fewer than 963 beds. First-time, nonviolent offenders were not separated from the repeat violent prisoners, and many were housed in unsanitary, overcrowded cells. The food quality was poor, which was not helped by the presence of cockroaches and mice. A visiting warden reported that the Penitentiary of New Mexico was the filthiest institution he had ever seen. The riot began on a chilly Saturday in February at 1:40 a.m. when 2 prisoners overpowered an official before he could close a door. There were 2 other officers in there who were taken by other prisoners. By 2:05 a.m., the prisoners had complete control of the prison and they demanded negotiations. 36 hours after the riot had begun, heavily armed state police officers entered the prison and took it back. 33 inmates died during this 36 hours, while over 200 were injured. Arthur Road Jail, officially named the Mumbai Central Prison, is Mumbai's largest and oldest prison. Mumbai is the capital of India, and the prison holds most of the city's prisoners. The jail was built to hold 800 prisoners, but the average number of inmates is 2,900, more than 3.5 times the intended capacity. In July of 2021, 8 new barracks were built to hold an additional 200 inmates. I don't know if you're doing the math there. 200 inmates, not enough. They are not building enough buildings for the people that are there. The building process had many delays, taking over 5 years due to lack of funds. This was done to try to alleviate the overcrowding, which is something that the prison is frequently criticized for. Yeah, you have 3.5 times as many people in there as it was built to hold. Oh man, you guys are going to add another 200 bunks? Okay, so it can hold 1,000 and you still have 3,000 in there. This prison holds gang members together that are in the same gang for their safety as well as the safety of others. We all know how these gang fights play out in prison. Muhanga prison in Rwanda actually doesn't have a lot of information online, which is kind of a relief for me, because that means that there's not enough controversy that is known to be put online. However, it has been described as the worst active prison in the world due to the fact that it was built to hold 500 inmates and holds 14 times that at 7,000. Located just south of the Oregon border in Del Norte County, California, the Supermax Pelican Bay State Prison sits on 275 acres. Opened in 1989, this prison contains 1,056 solitary confinement cells, with each cell being 8 foot by 10 foot. Each cell also has a concrete ledge with a foam pad that's supposed to act as a bed, and 2 concrete cubes that act as a desk and chair. Cell doors are controlled remotely and can let prisoners out to shower or to go exercise in each pod's solitary exercise yard. After the prison opened, the guards were eager to assert their dominance over their prisoners and established a culture of violence. Inmates were beaten, tied and left naked, and subject to gladiator fights. I wonder if the guards bet on those. They probably did. I wonder if there was like a favorite. I wonder if they dressed him up. They probably like dressed him up to like humiliate him and stuff, huh? Kind of sad. A federal district court judge ruled in 1995 that the prison was not being run in a constitutional way and ordered oversight by the prisoners' rights lawyers and other experts. In both 2011 and 2013, there were hunger strikes. Not just at Pelican Bay, but across all of California. Upwards of 29,000 prisoners joined the strike for warm clothes, 1 phone call per week, adequate food, and less time in isolation. The 2013 strike lasted for 2 months, and dozens of inmates were hospitalized. Being the largest prison in La Paz, Bolivia, the prison is renowned for being a society within itself. Vastly different from other prisons, the inmates at San Pedro have jobs, rent or buy their sleeping areas, and often live with their families. The prison has elected leaders who enforce the laws of the prison, mostly through stabbing. The prison is home to close to 3,000 prisoners, and that doesn't include the women and children that live there with their convicted husbands and fathers. The prison also has a hotel that guests can stay at. The main job of the guards at this prison is to patrol the outer walls to make sure that no prisoners escape. Latin American prisons, like San Pedro, are often referred to as warehouses because the guards are only concerned with keeping inmates inside and stopping riots. The guards don't actually care what happens to the inmates inside. Lack of authority, mixed with the economic troubles of living in a poverty-stricken country, make the guards vulnerable to bribery by inmates, however. Demonstrating the prisoners' bribery, the prison has an issue with cocaine trafficking, where guards are commonly bribed by prisoners to assist in the trafficking of drugs, both in and out of the prison. When an inmate enters the prison, they can either purchase or rent a cell from the prison mayor, or from an inmate real estate agent. I don't know what the commission is in there. Probably cheaper than here. How much do you think a cell is? Like, it's just, like if I moved there, The agents place advertisements in the prison restaurants and bulletin boards, and the prison's housing varies between $20 and $5,000. That I can afford. That I can afford. House in Utah? No, sir. House in the prison in Bolivia? I'm there. So as we continue down this iceberg, there are some prisons that do have less information online due to countries trying to keep them kind of hush-hush. However, we'll continue down the list, and I will give you as much information as I was able to find. Also, would you guys prefer to see my mouth move? Let me know. If so, it's there's right here, it's fine, but then the light causes a shadow when it's right here, and you can't really see my mouth moving that much. So let me know. The Ciudad Barrios prison in El Salvador is one of the most violent prisons in the country. Between 2004 and 2015, the prison exclusively housed members of the Mara Salvatrucha gang. During this time, El Salvador had a policy of segregating gang members in its prisons. The prison has since been militarized with soldiers acting as prison guards, and as of 2012, the prison housed 2,500 inmates, despite the building being meant to hold 800. The prison in Nairobi, Kenya, is the most congested prison in Kenya, with 3,800 inmates in a building made for 800 and 250 prisoners confined to a room designated for 50. The prisoners lack everything from mattresses to medical assistance and even clothes. Many inmates are virtually naked and constantly sweating from the heat and overcrowding. The prison doesn't only hold Kenyans, it also holds nationals of other countries. A prisoner from Nigeria is quoted as saying, "We are surviving by the grace of God. I don't think any human can survive here." Drapchi Prison is the largest prison in Tibet, China. The prison was built as a military garrison until it was converted in 1959 after the Tibetan uprising. The prison has gained a notorious reputation and is feared by Tibetans due to its strong and brutal management. In April 1996, 100 female political prisoners went on a hunger strike to protest the treatment of prisoners within the prison. The week-long strike was a concern for prison officers who were concerned that it would damage the reputation of the prison even further if the inmates died, and promised to end the brutality. Bang Kwang Prison is a men's prison in Thailand, just north of Bangkok. The prison houses the country's death row and execution chamber, and as of 2018, about 6,000 inmates inhabited the prison. The prison is harsh and handles the death row inmates, as well as prisoners with a long prison sentence. All inmates were required to wear leg irons permanently welded on. However, the requirement was ended in 2013. In 1995, a man from the UK was the first European to receive the death sentence in Thailand. He was freed after 17 years of what he calls hell in Bang Kwang Prison. It's Modelo time. La Modelo is a prison in Bogota, Colombia, with 11,000 inmates. The prison is known for its violence. The prison's north wing holds left-wing rebels, and the south wing has right-wing government supporters. The area between the two wings is where many killings within the prison take place. Guards don't carry weapons in the prison, however, the ones in guard towers do have rifles. Prisoners from both the north and the south wing have access to guns and grenades. Where are they getting grenades? In April 2000, 25 prisoners were murdered while fighting. After the killings were publicized, the government began to change the prison regime. In 2016, the dismembered remains of over 100 prisoners were found in the drain pipes within the jail. On March 21st of 2020, at least 23 prisoners were killed and 83 were injured during a riot that erupted amid fears over COVID-19. Located in Venezuela, El Rodillo is considered one of the most brutal active prisons today. Under the presidency of Hugo Chavez, overcrowded prisons and crime have overrun Venezuela. The prison population of the country recently soared over 50,000, with over 3/5 of the inmates still waiting to be sentenced. So 3/5 of these 50,000 inmates haven't even been sentenced, and they're still in prison. It's messed up. I don't like it when Venezuela does it. I don't like it when America does it. It's not how it works. Chavez himself described the Venezuelan prison system as, quote, the gateway to the fifth circle of hell. Guns and grenades. I'm not sure where these prisoners all over the world are getting grenades. I'm actually kind of jealous. Guns and grenades are often a common sight being wielded by inmates. On June 12, 2011, one of the bloodiest days of the prison system occurred. The National Guard was sent in to control a shootout between rival gangs where 27 people were killed. They found machine guns and grenades within the prison. The discovery of the weapons caused them to stop the siege on the prison's second unit, and they drew out inmates with tear gas instead. However, some inmates managed to last an entire month under siege from the National Guard, surviving on rainwater and stored baked goods. This prison actually is an ancient Roman prison. The prison was constructed in 640 BC, 2,662 years ago, and was a place made for temporary holding of people prior to trial or execution. Many abuses occurred, but were censured by the government. Often overcrowded and foul, the prison was rampant with disease. Today, the prison is the site of 2 churches used for Christian worship. It is unknown when the prison officially closed, and the prison holds significance to Christians, as it is said that St. Peter and St. Paul were imprisoned there. Many other historical figures were held at the prison. Black Beach Prison, located on the island of Bioko in Equatorial Guinea, is one of Africa's most notorious prisons. The prison has a reputation of neglecting and brutalizing inmates. Medical treatment is denied to inmates when needed, and food rations are meager at best. The United Nations has stated minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners that requires at least minimal medical treatment for all prisoners. However, Black Beach isn't exactly following that rule. Torture runs rampant, and the prison is considered highly dangerous. Mendoza Prison in Argentina is synonymous with inhumane conditions, torture, and death. The prison holds 1,600 inmates in a building that was built for 600. In 2005, Amnesty International condemned the conditions of the prison. They said the inmates who were not yet sentenced or tried may come out worse than when they entered. The prison's guard are part of the issue, as they are notorious for abusing the inmates and the inmates' families. People imprisoned there are in such desperate situations that they have gone as far as to sew their mouths shut to demand better living conditions. Up to 5 prisoners sleep on the floor without a mattress in a 12 square foot cell. They defecate in plastic bags and urinate in bottles. The hallway holds several days' worth of garbage and are frequently flooded by sewage. So 12 square feet. Wow. That's very minimal. That's like 6 feet by 2 feet. If it was 6 feet by 2 feet, I couldn't lay down anywhere. I'm 6'4". There's no room for me to lay down. ADX Florence, found in Florence, Colorado, USA, is classified as a supermax prison. There is a higher, more controlled level of rules and custody than even a maximum security prison. The prison was built specifically for the secure housing of prisoners who were considered most capable of extreme, sustained violence towards staff and other inmates. As of June 2022, there were 344 inmates. The prisoners are confined 23 hours per day in a single cell, with cells made of reinforced concrete, and under 24-hour supervision with high staff to inmate ratios. Called the Alcatraz of the Rockies, ADX Florence holds some of the country's most dangerous inmates. Foreign as well as domestic terrorists are held there, people found guilty of espionage and organized crime. ADX is so feared around the world that in 2020, a British magistrate refused to extradite WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to the US because it was possible that he would be held at ADX Florence. In 2021, the British High Court said that the US could appeal the decision with the understanding that Assange, quote, will not be imprisoned at ADX should he be extradited. While the prison holds many prisoners, it holds some well-known prisoners. Many Al-Qaeda members are held there, including Al-Qaeda co-founder and advisor to Osama bin Laden, Mamdouh Muhammad Salim. Also housed there are domestic terrorists, including the 2013 Boston Marathon bomber, the Oklahoma City bomber. There was 2 of them, one of them's dead, one of them's still alive and being held in ADX. And former prisoner, and one of my favorite people to research, very interesting person, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. However, Ted was moved to a medical facility in North Carolina as he said he has cancer and about a year to live. Gitarama prison in Rwanda is one of the deadliest in the world. The conditions of the prison are a nightmare, as 7,000 inmates are locked inside. However, the maximum capacity of the jail is 400. The prisoners spend most of their time standing due to the space shortage. The worst part of the prison is that the inmates frequently fight to the death and eat the corpses of the killed prisoners to stay alive. On top of this, it's said that 7 to 8 prisoners a day die in the jail due to poor conditions. The prisoners are barefoot and suffer from gangrene. Many human rights organizations have protested the conditions of the prison but have not made any headway. These numbers were pre-COVID, however, and could have skyrocketed again due to the cramped conditions. About 150 miles northeast of Damascus, located in the desert of Syria, the French built Tadmor Prison in the 1930s. Between 1971 and 2000, thousands of political dissidents were humiliated, tortured, and executed at Tadmor. One of the prisoners that had been kept there said the following: "It's utterly unfair to call it a prison. In a prison you have basic rights, but in Tadmor you have nothing. You're only left with fear and horror." There was a prison massacre in 1980 where, after a failed assassination attempt, Assad's brother flew from Damascus to Tadmor via helicopter. Soldiers then went from cell to cell shooting prisoners with machine guns. There is no exact number on how many people were killed that day, but it's estimated that between 500 and 1,000 people were killed in just the few minutes that the massacre took place, and their bodies were dumped in a mass grave just outside the prison. Solitary confinement in this prison is made up of 19 cells, all of which are found underground. It's forbidden to raise your head, look up, or look at other inmates, and eye contact is strictly forbidden. Many prisoners consider the ones that got shot the lucky ones, and a memoir by a former prisoner contained the following: "When death is a daily occurrence, lurking in torture, random beatings, eye gougings, broken limbs, and crushed fingers, wouldn't you welcome the merciful release of a bullet?" Torture upon arrival was not only common, but just part of life at Tadmor. Referred to as the reception party, prisoners were pulled off the bus, whipped mercilessly and brutally until everyone was out, stripped naked, and put into a car tire, where each person was beaten on their feet between 200 and 400 times. Left with their legs bleeding and covered in wounds, the people who survived the initial torture had just gotten a little taste of what was to come. It's reported that guards would find new ways of torture and humiliation out of pure boredom. One night, a prisoner was told by a guard to move all 100 pairs of slippers out of the holding area, and he could only use his mouth. There was also an incident where 2 prisoners were forced to hold an inmate by his hands and feet, raise him high into the air, and then fling him onto the ground. One prisoner refused to do so and was beaten in the head so mercilessly that he died a month later. When inmates cry out for medical attention for themselves or for other dying prisoners, the guards simply answer with, "Only call us to collect the bodies." When the Islamic State took over the country, they destroyed the prison, which was no longer in use. Some former prisoners said that destroying the prison was a blow to history, as it should have been preserved to learn from the past, and have gone as far to call it a huge service to Assad's regime of slavery. With at most 1 guard for every 100 inmates, what at first might seem like a good thing for prisoners is actually causing adverse effects. The most common thing said about this prison is that once you go in, you will most likely not come out alive. There are almost no barriers within the prison, so hardened and dangerous criminals are held, with first-time young offenders serving time for petty offenses. The reason this prison is so low on the iceberg is because the high number of inmates killing each other. Every day. Constantly. Horyong concentration camp, known simply as Camp 22, was, and possibly still is, a maximum security prison completely isolated from the outside world. In 2012, satellite images showed the possible closure of Camp 22, but with no confirmation, it can't be known for sure. Located in North Korea, near the border with China, Camp 22 has always been denied by the North Korean government. With about 87 square miles of land, Camp 22 is surrounded by an inner 3,300-volt electric fence and an outer barbed wire fence, with both traps and hidden nails between the two fences. With roughly 1,000 guards and 600 administrative agents, the guards are equipped with machine guns, grenades, whips, and trained dogs to control nearly 50,000 inmates. Prisoners mostly consist of people who criticize the government, South Korean POWs, and purged senior party members. Due to the country's guilt by association principle, the prisoners are often imprisoned together with their whole family, including children and the elderly. All prisoners were detained until they died, never to be released. The camp is likened to that of one of the Nazi concentration camps. Information about the inside of the camp is limited due to the government denying it and only a few people having ever escaped. The main reason successful escapes have been so few and far between is due to the fact that anyone who tries, plans, or even has knowledge of an escape is executed, with all the other prisoners required to watch. A former prisoner named Shin Dong-yuk, who spent 23 years in the prison and escaped, talked about his experience. He said that the conditions are so bad that 20 to 25% of the prison population dies every year. Shin was actually born in the prison, and due to the guilty by association rule, was kept there. Starvation at the prison is common, as prisoners are usually fed only gruel made of cornmeal and cabbage. Prisoners were always hungry, and were told, "Through hunger you will repent." Prisoners would often eat rats and insects to stay alive, with the rats being few and far between due to the fact that they are always caught and eaten. Prisoners often develop a hunchback due to the lack of protein and calcium in their diets, and bending over in the fields all day. The prisoners also often lose fingers and toes due to frostbite, as they wear makeshift shoes made out of car tires. Prisoners are considered less than bugs to the warden and guards, and due to that, many prisoners are beaten and executed solely for stress relief for the guards. Shin talks about how he was tortured at the age of 13. Shin's older brother, as well as his mother, were accused of attempting an escape. They dragged him underground and hanged him by his ankles and tortured him with fire. Torture in the prison is common. Some forms are more disturbing than others, obviously. Guard dogs would sometimes lose control and kill and eat prisoners, which they would then be praised for. Pregnancy is forbidden except in the case of a marriage arranged by the prison guards. If a woman is found pregnant outside of this arranged and sham marriage, the guards will cut the woman open, throw the fetus away, and then execute the woman. Even if a person makes it past the guards, past the dogs, over both fences, and out of eyesight, they still have to make it into and then out of China, where if they are caught, they will be sent back. Kim Jong-un runs North Korea out of fear, including the fear of these camps, as North Koreans outside of the camps want to avoid it at all costs. Demolished in 2002, Carandiru Penitentiary in Brazil was home to the Carandiru Massacre. Around 1:30 p.m. on October 2nd, 1992, two groups got into a fight after a football match. The fight quickly escalated into a full-on prison riot that lasted for 3 hours. Prisoners were reported attacking each other with pipes and knives. 2,069 prisoners versus 15 guards is what it ended up at, and obviously a huge advantage for the prisoners, which resulted in the guards losing control of the prison very quickly. 45 minutes later, around 2:15, the prison director informed the military police about the uprising. The military was given full control of the prison upon their arrival around 2:30. The director wanted to negotiate with the prisoners, however, he was held back by his staff since when the military police showed up, they almost crushed him on their way in. The prisoners were then stripped, locked into their cells, and shot. Other prisoners were killed by police dogs, including wounded prisoners who were being kept in the barber shop. At the time, the facility was a detention center, not a penitentiary, so the inmates hadn't been tried or convicted in any capacity yet. By the time it was all over, 111 prisoners were dead and 37 were injured. Ballistic analysis shows that 515 bullets were found in the prisoners, and the gunshot wounds were mainly found in the face, head, throat, and chest. The hands among the dead were found in front of their face or behind their heads, suggesting defensive positions. No policemen were injured. Being a military prison near Damascus, Syria, Sednaya prison is a nightmare among nightmares. Sednaya is actually pretty close to Tadmor prison from earlier on the same tier, so it's safe to say that Assad's Syria is a hellhole for prisons. It is estimated that between 5,000 and 13,000 people were executed between September 2011 and December 2015. A former inmate of the prison who was detained for participating in a protest told Amnesty International that at Sednaya prison, prisoners were forced to choose between dying themselves or killing one of their relatives or friends. To kind of demonstrate how bad this prison was, a former inmate said that he was imprisoned at a prison previous to Sednaya where people were fed so little that they were forced into cannibalism. However, that prison was heaven compared to Sednaya. The inmate said that the first prison was to integrate through torture, but once that was done, you were moved to Sednaya to die. The prison is known for its torture of people suspected of opposing the government. Prisoners consist of men, women, and children. Much like Todmor, there is a welcome party where the prisoners are beaten right off the bus. Omar al-Shorg used to be imprisoned at Sednaya, and he was beaten so badly at the welcome party that he couldn't open his eyes or stand for 15 days. He then faced trial for terrorism, a trial that lasted 5 seconds. He contracted tuberculosis and witnessed organ harvesting. A leaked document shows credible signs of starvation, brutal beatings, strangulation, and other forms of torture and killing. Once to twice a week, 20 to 25 prisoners are taken out of their cells in the dead of night and hanged. Another former prisoner said that he was forced to squeeze his head through a small hatch near the bottom of his cell door. The hatch was then made smaller by the guards and they would jump on his head with all their weight. The guards wouldn't stop until a stream of blood could be seen. Electricity is also a common form of torture at the prison. One popular form of torture at the prison is called the barrel method. A prisoner would stand on a barrel, they would tie ropes from the ceiling around their wrists. They would then remove the barrel, leaving the prisoner hanging. At this point, they would beat the prisoner with sticks, burn the prisoner with cigarettes, then electrocute them. In 2017, the United States accused the Syrian government of engaging in mass executions and covering it up with a crematorium that was built, so that the government could hide the real numbers of the executed. The justification of this accusation was satellite images that showed snow had melted on a single building in the prison, the one that the US thought was the crematorium. However, the United States State Department later agreed that the snow melt could have just been a warmer part of the building, and no former prisoners or guards have ever mentioned a crematorium. Similar to their older prisons, Mongolia's prisons are known for their harsh conditions and cruel punishments still today. However, Urga prison in Mongolia is both an old prison and one of the cruelest. Sometimes referred to as a coffin prison, Urga inmates are held in wooden boxes, measuring 4 feet wide by 2.5 feet tall. When locked inside the boxes, it was so cramped that a person could neither sit nor lay down properly. Each box had only one small hole to allow in light and to feed the prisoners. But as the boxes themselves were held underground, not much light would get in. The prisoners were fed once a day, and their waste would be cleaned out once every 2 or 3 weeks. People would often lose their vision and their sanity in these boxes. The prisoners that the guards thought had the best chance of escaping also had their necks chained to their hands. For people who had committed lesser crimes, the torture of these boxes, which are the cells of the prison, would only last a few weeks. For everyone else, they would remain in those boxes the entire stay in the prison, which would make them lose the ability of their limbs. A lot of the prisoners held here were sentenced to death. However, most of them would die before their death sentence could be carried out. It's common for prisoners to freeze to death, as during the winter, the temp would drop below 0, and the prison is essentially an underground cave with lots and lots of boxes. People would also often starve to death, and starvation is a common problem that the prisons in Mongolia still face today. Located in Israel and run by the Israel Defense Forces, Camp 1391 is a prison for high-risk prisoners. The prison's existence was unknown to the public before 2013, and most information about it remains classified. The location of the prison was found by complete accident. Historian Gad Kreuzer found a 70-year-old map drawn by a government architect while researching old British police buildings. One camp, labeled as Merits, did not appear on any modern Israeli maps. Gad published an article in an academic journal mentioning the prison location in the footnote. Days later, he was contacted by the military censor asking why the article had not been submitted for inspection. Prior to this, the facility had been airbrushed from Israeli aerial photographs and purged from modern maps. Dubbed the Israeli Guantanamo, even the Minister of Justice was not aware of its existence. It is said that anyone entering the prison can be made to disappear, potentially forever. According to former inmates, they were led into a facility blindfolded and kept in cells that were 6 feet by 6 feet with no natural light. The cells don't have adequate toilet facilities, and the guards control the running water. A former prisoner who was released in a prison swap has filed a lawsuit in Tel Aviv's district court claiming that he was sexually abused in the prison. The prisoners, their families, lawyers, etc. are not told where they are. No independent organization is allowed to inspect the prison. The United Nations Committee Against Torture stated that Israel security secretly detains and interrogates prisoners in an unknown location called Camp 1391 without granting access to the committee, the International Red Cross, or the lawyers or relatives of the prisoners. Israeli officials say that Camp 1391 is no longer used since 2006 to detain or interrogate suspects. Several petitions filed to the Israeli Supreme Court by the UN Committee Against Torture to examine the facility have been rejected, however. The court also refused to allow an inquiry on the alleged abuses, saying that Israeli authorities had acted reasonably in not conducting investigations into allegations of torture. With that said, it can't be known for sure if the prison is still operational today in the same capacity. Closed in 2013, the La Sabaneta prison, located in Venezuela, was considered the most violent prison in the world. Plans to convert the prison into a museum has brought some of the horrors to light. When the prison closed, it held 3,000 more people than it was built for at 3,700 prisoners. Almost 200 of the occupants were children of the inmates. A fire was started by a group of inmates due to gang activity, and people who tried to escape the blaze were stabbed or shot. It's reported that over 150 inmates were killed as security guards attempted to regain control of the facility. A former inmate who survived the incident said that the prisoners had firearms, Molotov cocktails, and knives. This prison had constant gang violence and deaths, and was known as one of Venezuela's scariest prisons. The Scorpion Prison, located in Egypt, is a prison that almost completely deprives inmates of adequate ventilation, electricity, and hot water. This is a change that was made in mid-November of 2020 due to an incident in September of that same year. This prison is known for this kind of collective punishment, and a blanket ban on family visits has been in place since 2018, and a ban on exercise hours was enacted in 2019 with 24-hour confinement to cells. Scorpion Prison is designed so that those who go in don't come out again unless they're dead, said former Scorpion warden. It is said that 2 or 3 inmates occupy a single cell that is 6 feet by 9 feet, and that every other cell is kept empty so it's harder for inmates to communicate to others outside the cell. The prison breaks almost every rule of the UN standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. There is an absence of sufficient natural light, lack of humane sleeping conditions, sanitation, as well as inadequate floor space, artificial lighting, and proper ventilation. In 2017, the Egyptian court system accepted a case brought by Scorpion inmates' families seeking to have the prison shut down. However, a decision was never reached as the lawyer who filed the case stopped working on it due to security threats. We've reached the final tier of the iceberg, and there's only one prison here. Unit 731 in Japan is the worst prison known to have ever existed. Operative during World War II, Unit 731 was a biological and chemical warfare research and development unit that engaged in lethal human experimentation. Prisoners were dehumanized and referred to as logs. Experiments included injection of disease, controlled dehydration, hyperbaric chamber experiments, biological weapons testing, amputation, and regular weapons testing. Vivisection is a type of surgery typically conducted for experimental purposes to view living internal structure. Thousands of men, women, children, and infants were subjected to vivisections, often performed without anesthesia. A former Unit 731 employee admitted to having performed a vivisection on a pregnant woman. The vivisections were performed on prisoners after infecting them with various diseases. Researchers performed invasive surgeries on prisoners, removing organs to study the effects of disease on the human body. Prisoners often had limbs amputated in order to study blood loss. Limbs that were removed were sometimes reattached to the opposite side of the victims' bodies. Some prisoners had their stomachs surgically removed and their esophagus reattached to their intestines. Parts of organs such as livers, lungs, and brain were removed. Unit 731 was involved in research, development, and experimental deployment of epidemic-creating biowarfare against the Chinese people throughout World War II. Plague-infected fleas bred in the lab at 731 were introduced into Chinese cities where tens of thousands of people were killed with the Black Plague. These diseases and systems were tested on prisoners in 731 to test their efficiency before being deployed on the public. Human targets were used at 731 to test grenades positioned at various distances and in various positions. The people that worked there also tested flamethrowers on living people. Victims were also tied to stakes and used to test pathogen-releasing bombs, chemical weapons, shrapnel bombs, explosive bombs, as well as bayonets and knives. In other tests, subjects were deprived of food and water to determine the length of time until death, placed into low-pressure chambers until their eyes popped from their sockets, experimented on to determine the relationship between temperature, burns, and human survival, hung upside down until death, crushed with heavy objects, electrocuted, dehydrated with hot fans, placed into centrifuges and spun to death, injected with animal blood, exposed to lethal doses of X-rays, subjected to various chemical weapons inside gas chambers, injected with seawater, and burned or buried alive. Massive amounts of blood were drained from select prisoners to study the effects of blood loss. A number of women, children, and men were essentially mummified alive due to dehydration experiments. They would sweat themselves to death under the heat of several hot, dry fans, and at death, their corpses weigh about a fifth of normal body weight. Blood experiments were performed on prisoners, where type A blood was given to someone with type O blood, AB to O, and AB to B. The biggest changes were with people who had type O blood and were given the other types, as it would raise their heart rate, give them a fever, and cause temporary partial paralysis in both legs. People were blindfolded with their hands tied behind them to a post within a 97 square foot glass chamber. Chemicals including mustard gas, lewisite, cyanic acid gas, white phosphorus, adamsite, and phosphine gas would be released into the chamber. A former army major and technician said, "The gas used on this person was adamsite, and as the gas filled the chamber, the man went into a violent coughing convulsions and began to suffer excruciating pain. More than 10 doctors and techs were present. After I had watched for 10 minutes, I could not stand it anymore, and I left the area." A former medical worker at 731 said that he saw a man who was vertically cut into 2 pieces and pickled in a jar of formaldehyde. Many of the tests have been described as psychopathically sadistic with no conceivable military application. An example of one of these is an experiment documenting the time it took for 3-day-old babies to freeze to death. 20 subjects were placed in different conditions to see the effects of mustard gas on the human body with different types of environments and different types of equipment. Some had gas masks, some were clothed, etc. Frostbite testing was also something that the prison was known for. Prisoners would be taken outside and would have various appendages dipped into water of varying temperatures. Then, the limbs would be allowed to freeze. Once frozen, a guard would hit the affected limb with a short stick. Ice was then chipped away and the area was subjected to various treatments, such as being doused in more water, exposed to fire, etc. Army engineer Yoshimura was described by the other members of Unit 731 as a scientific devil and a cold-blooded animal, because he would conduct his work with strictness. In testimony given, a former member of 731 described a scene where Yoshimura had, quote, Two named men put into an area 40 to 50 degrees below zero, and researchers filmed the whole process until the subjects died. They suffered such agony that they dug their nails into each other's flesh. Yoshimura wrote an article for the Journal of Japanese Philosophy in which he admitted to using 20 children and a 3-day-old infant in experiments which exposed them to freezing ice and salt water. While the article drew criticism, he denied any guilt and said that he developed a resistance index of frostbite based on the mean temperature 5 to 30 minutes after immersion in the freezing water. He also noted that bodies reacted differently based on how the person had been treated beforehand. Awake for 24 hours, no food for 24, 48 hours or longer, right after a heavy meal, right after a hot meal, right after exercise, right after a cold bath, right after a hot bath, etc. Unit members would force sex acts between prisoners infected and not infected with syphilis to transmit the disease. Infection of venereal disease by injection was abandoned, and the researchers would force a male and a female, one infected and one not, to have sexual relations. It was also made clear that anyone resisting would be shot. After people were infected with the disease, they would be vivisected at different stages of the infection so that internal and external organs could be observed as the disease progressed. Female prisoners were forced to become pregnant for use in experiments. The stated reason for the torture was possible vertical transmission of diseases from the mother to the child. Fetal survival and damage to the mother's reproductive organs were objects of interest and study. Though a large number of babies were born in captivity, there are no accounts of any survivors of Unit 731. It is suspected that the children of female prisoners were killed after birth or aborted. One former unit member gave the following testimony of sex crimes at the prison. Quote, "One of the former researchers I located told me that one day he had a human experiment scheduled, but he had time to kill before then. So, he and another unit member took the keys to the cell and opened a cell door that housed a Chinese woman. The unit members forced themselves upon her before they locked the door and left, where they went on with their experimental research." In 2002, China accused Japan of killing over 580,000 people with their experiments inside and outside of Unit 731. The majority of victims at Unit 731 were Chinese. However, there were also Russians, Mongolians, Koreans, Europeans, Americans, Indians, Australians, and New Zealander prisoners of war. Not a single prisoner who entered Unit 731 left the prison alive. Prisoners would be dropped off at Unit 731 at night in a car painted black with a ventilation hole but no windows. Once a prisoner was cleared as healthy and fit for experimentation, prisoners lost their name and were given a 3-digit number, which they retained until their death. Once a prisoner died, the clerk of the prison would strike their number from an index card and take the chains and locks to be put on new arrivals to the prison. Prisoners were experimented on as long as they were deemed healthy enough. The average life expectancy of a prisoner at Unit 731 was 2 months. A former member of the unit said the following about his first vivisection conducted at the unit. "He didn't struggle when they led him into the room and tied him down, but when I picked up the scalpel, that's when he began screaming. I cut him open from the chest to the stomach, and he screamed terribly, and his face was all twisted in agony. He made an unimaginable sound. He was screaming so horribly, but then finally he stopped. This was all in a day's work for the surgeons, but it really left an impression on me because it was my first time." Other sources suggest that it was the usual practice in the unit for the surgeons to stuff a rag into the mouth of prisoners before commencing vivisection in order to stifle any screaming. Unit 731 was divided into 8 divisions. Division 1 was research on the Black Plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, and tuberculosis using live human subjects. Division 2 was research for biological weapons. 3 was the production of shells containing biological agents. 4 was the bacteria mass production and storage area. 5 was used for personnel training, and Divisions 6 through 8 were the equipment, medical, and administrative units respectively. The prison sat on 2.3 square miles and had over 150 buildings that are designed in such a way that it makes them hard to destroy via bombing. Once the Japanese surrendered at the end of World War II, the prison was closed. With the Red Army on their doorstep in August of 1945, they destroyed all evidence within the unit, ordered by Tokyo. Over 900 people were executed during the destruction of evidence, and the workers were told to disappear and to take the secret to their grave. They were also given potassium cyanide in case they were captured. Skeleton crews tried to blow up the compound in the final days of the war, but due to their design mentioned earlier, they were sturdy enough for many of them to remain intact. That's it. That's the end of the Iceberg. I hope you can see why Unit 731 has a place by itself on the list, as there are really no other prisons like it in terms of horror. What the people who ran and worked at the prison did to other people is unforgivable, and I sincerely hope that they rot forever. Rest the souls of the people who died in 731. I hope you enjoyed the series, and I hope you enjoyed the videos in between. This is my first attempt at any sort of content like this. When I first started making this Iceberg, I was going to make it one video, but after I got to tier 4 and I was like, I can't, this is too long for one video. I got to split it up into 3, and I think that was a good idea. I want to thank everyone for being on this journey with me, and I hope you've learned something from these videos. Feel free to subscribe if you haven't, and if you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. I truly do appreciate each and every one of you for watching. And before I wrap this video, I do want to say that you can expect more from me in the future. I have a whole ton of videos in the pipeline. If you'd like to suggest any, leave them in the comments down below. I'd also like to give a huge shout out to my girlfriend. She's the one that had the confidence to push me to finally do this. I've been talking and thinking about making this sort of content for years now, and she gave me the little push that I needed, so I appreciate it. She also drew this. She drew this for me. How cool is that? Again, thank you all for watching. I truly do appreciate you, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.